temporal lobes are called the what pathway in the brain because it helps name what things are. When there are problems in this part of the brain, and this is actually one of my favorite patients from a place called Normal, Illinois. So you heard me talk about Normal is a myth. It's a setting on a dryer. Well, people from Normal have the same problems that they have everywhere else. This person had actually been arrested for domestic violence, and when I scanned him, his temporal lobe was damaged, and I went, "Do you ever have a brain injury?" And he said, "No," like many of our patients do. And I said, "Well, are you sure? Have you ever fallen out of a tree, off a fence, dove into a shallow pool?" And he's like, "Oh my God, when I was 6 years old, I was standing on the rail on a porch, and I fell 6 feet head first into a pile of bricks." And my parents said after that I was angry and irritable and would explode for little or no reason. When we see trouble in the left temporal lobe, more so than the right, people can have these really dark thoughts, awful thoughts, evil thoughts sometimes. When there are problems in the temporal lobe, now it'll depend on where it is, but for example, if you heard the amygdala, which is at the front middle part of the temporal lobe, or we call it the anterior medial part of the temporal lobe, people can have rage attacks. It's actually in the scientific literature, if they damage that part of a monkey's brain, for example, they can get this thing called sham rage for like no reason at all. And so when we see damage to the temporal lobes, emotional instability, can't predict their mood. They can have memory problems, especially if that affects the hippocampus. Anxiety that just comes out of the blue, so they can have panic or fear. There's one study that showed 30% of people who ended up with a diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy actually started with symptoms of anxiety or panic. Aggression, more so on the left side than the right. Headaches that nobody can figure out why may actually be a temporal lobe epilepsy equivalent. Learning problems. So if it's on the left side, more language-based learning problems. So things like dyslexia, reading. If it's on the right side, more issues with social learning. We also see when there are problems in the temporal lobes that people might have tummy aches for little or no reason. It's something called abdominal epilepsy that comes from the temporal lobes. They might also get visual changes. We talked about the temporal lobes being the what pathway and naming what things are, but when there's trouble there, sometimes things will get bigger than they're supposed to be. That's called macropsia, or things